Welcome to the Potomac Foundation series, The Mind of the Strategist, where we interview national security leaders who have actually been involved in not only thinking about strategy, but watching it being implemented from the inside. This is our second session with Andy Marshall, the founder and director of Net Assessment in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Welcome back, Andy.
Thank you.
Andy, as we sit here, in the last 24 hours, Russian tanks are mobilizing on the Ukrainian border. The Chinese are accusing the Japanese of developing nuclear weapons. Syria is in revolt. Venezuela is in riot. And radical Islamists have been killing kids in schools in Nigeria. I understand your world just isn't boring, is it? I wanted to ask you, when you are on the National Security Council, the National Security Council ends up being a crisis management place. How are they able to think sort of long term, particularly when they're dealing with multiple crises, so they can actually anticipate what might happen and be better prepared?
Well, I think, it depends on the character of the president and of the head of the National Security Advisor himself. And I think, Kissinger, when he went into it, hoped to spend more time on the longer term, but I think was driven to shorter term things, although there were various kind of longer term strategic moves undertaken, such as the opening to China and the continual effort to deal with the Soviet Union and the major issues, compliance with previous arrangements or previous agreements.
Is that one of the reasons why he recruited you? I know he wanted you to evaluate the intelligence community, but was that one of the purposes of an Office of Net Assessment, to kind of give a broader, longer range?
I think, as I mentioned the last time, I don't really know why he raised this matter of net assessment. There had been this effort in the summer of 1950 when he had assembled a group of people, of which I was one.
You said 1950?
1970. 70, sorry, yes. Where he wanted some advice as to possible programs or increases in existing programs that he could have in mind and in his hip pocket, so to speak, if the Soviets broke away or did not live up to various agreements in the arms limitation area. So this group was formed, and as part of that effort, there was an assessment undertaken that was done largely by Jim Schlesinger and myself. Well, in the end, I ended up writing most of it, and it may be that he found that analysis interesting and wanted to repeat it, but I was never told, and I never asked about exactly why. I was pretty clear why the other function of the office would appeal to him, because, as I mentioned, the Nixon reorganization of the intelligence community as part of it, there was to be this new NSC committee that Kissinger would chair, and he needed some staff support for that.
Now, I know that one of the reasons that you went to the Pentagon was because of Schlesinger, but if Schlesinger hadn't been at the Pentagon, would you prefer to stay at the NSC and do those functions of net assessment?
Well,
there?
what I would have preferred was, since by the time the issue arose of going to the Pentagon, I was on the thought I had served the couple of years that I had promised to serve, and that my wife and I would have been very happy to go back to California.
But structurally, organizationally, do you think it would have been better to have, if you hadn't had the draw and the personal relationship with Schlesinger, to try to build that function in the NSC?
No, I don't.
Okay. Why?
Well, for one thing, we were having such a difficult time getting it started. And I think...
Because of opposition or lack of resources or inertia?
Well, to negotiate what the process would be like, I think based on some conversations I've recently had with Mel Laird, I think that this is a guess. I mean, he really wanted to establish a net assessment function in defense.
Right. Per the Blue Ribbon panel.
Yeah, I mean, he was in favor of it even before the Blue Ribbon panel, and so saw something he really wanted to do, and so it's possible, it'd be interesting to ask him, when Kissinger decides to start something up in the NSC, that this in some way would complicate or was a way of moving the main net assessment function to the NSC. I'm not sure.
So it's interesting. I was reading minutes of a SecDef meeting, and I think it was Al Hall, who was then Assistant Secretary for Intelligence.
Yeah, he was one of the guys I was mainly meeting with.
Yeah, but he was really negative. I mean, in this meeting, he was like, the NSC is taking away our men. It was. But you actually dealt. Your reactions or interactions with him were very fine. Yeah. So your feeling is that you really need the resources in the Pentagon to as opposed to try to beg, borrow, and steal at the NSC? Is
well, I think it depends a bit on how you conceive net assessments. Or, I mean, as I mentioned last time, I think one of the things I found when I've sort of given the task, I talked to people about what it was they wanted out of the net assessment, and it seemed to me that mainly they wanted a kind of process that would, so to speak, tell you the score at a particular time. That is, if a war happens tomorrow, who wins?
How we doing?
And whereas what I thought it should be was it would look at these things as assessments, of particular areas as areas of competition that would be conducted over a period of time, and that what was needed is analysis that would lead to greater understanding of the nature of this competition, what are the key sub-competitions, also how various trends in technology or other things may be affecting the strengths, weaknesses of both sides.
So if I can use a football analogy, what they were sort of thinking they wanted was a scorekeeper in the middle of a game.
Yeah, right.
And you were really thinking about, okay, what's the campaign over a whole season?
That's right.
What do we need to be at? What future teams? Yeah. How do we posture ourselves? Right. Who do we recruit? Right. What do we get in the draft and so forth?
Yes, and therefore it seems to me it fitted much better in defense, where the secretary clearly has an interest in and some significant role in, the future forces and their evolution of the forces.
Let me ask you a kind of an obvious question. Why can't the Joint Chiefs of Staff do that?
Well, ideally they would. I think my experience is they don't really.
Yeah.
They just don't.
What is it? Is it a mindset? Is it just too much officer rotation, so there's not enough continuity? A tendency to put your fingers on the scale because you don't want to look bad, or well, on the other hand, you want to
I don't have a good explanation of exactly what. Although, we had a particular specific case back when Don Rumsfeld came back in 2001, and he asked me to write a strategy paper to be used as a basis for thinking about where things should go with respect to forces and so on. And we did that, and as part of that, we suggested that the Joint Chiefs themselves should be the ones who would be the source of the judgments as to which handful of areas ought to be preferentially invested in over the course of the next couple of decades. Mm-hmm.
So you're pushing them out beyond the 5-year program.
Yes. Right. And they simply refused to address it.
Did they say why?
No, I didn't ever have a chance to ask them, but I mean...
They just...
Paul, no answer.
One of the things that when you're looking out over a season or building a team over the long term as opposed to the score in a game is to evaluate your opposition. What are their resources?
Right.
How much are they spending? How much do they have? What are their strengths and weaknesses? What was your, and of course the assumption is that is naturally the function of the intelligence community. When you were in the 70s looking at that, how did that go in terms of their perceptions of what the Soviets were spending and so forth?
Well, that was a problem basically right from the beginning. I mean, now, again, Schlesinger and I had talked about that back at RAND. I mean, one of the things we had some doubts about was that the Soviet Union, which then was thought to have a GNP about half the size of ours, roughly, was nonetheless producing a set of forces as substantial as ours, and in many areas even more substantial.
Like we had 15 divisions, they had 150 or something.
Said by the CIA to take up a mere 6% of their GNP.
It's roughly the same percentage as ours.
Yes, at the time. You know, so, and we were skeptical about that.
Now, Alan Enthoven and Kay Wayne Smith, who were in the system
Yeah.
analysis office, and I think Kay Wayne later
Yeah.
worked with you in the NSC, their argument was, well, the stuff the Soviets were buying for that amount of money wasn't very good. But then another equation could be maybe we were misunderstanding
Yes.
their spending.
Right. Right. And I think, you know, after a more than decade-long kind of struggle over the matter, certainly much more than a decade.
So from basically when you come from the NSC all the way up through the Cold War, huh? Until the
More or less,
mid-'80s at least?
It took the end of the Cold War, really, to finally have some admission about it. But it was kind of gradual, I mean, because while they, let me just go back and say, Schlesinger was very interested in that, and so when he became the secretary, one of the first tasks he gave me was to go again to the intelligence community, or to CIA really, and say, would they please look closely at this matter again?
Now, this is after you spent a couple of years sort of evaluating.
No, he already, when he was the DCI, had an argument with them about it.
Here he is, the head of the CIA,
Yeah, right,
and his own staffer sort of fighting
right.
it.
But at any rate, one of the first things when I got to the Pentagon, he wanted me to formulate a directive to them, or a request for them to look again. And they did that and came back with an answer saying, no, we still think it's, 6 to 8% at most. And then shortly after that, they doubled their estimate.
So it went from about 6 to 12.
Yes. Based supposedly, they said, on new information and so on. But even that did not satisfy me, because there were many things in the Soviet military preparations which they simply weren't costing. I mean, I think what they were basically doing was taking the visible equipment and people in uniform and trying to make an estimate of the cost of that.
So they look at they see tanks and airplanes, and they say, okay, that's so
And
many divisions, so many air wings,
so on, right.
were they using the way we cost it as the basis, or did they?
Some of it, but then they had special efforts to try to understand the cost exchange, or the changes ruble to ruble dollars for particular areas and so on.
But your point is that there was a lot of stuff that was building on the civilian, or on the civilian.
Well, I mean, as you will remember, I mean, there were Baltic ferries, but they were like no car ferries you would ever see in the Western world, with specialized ramps to.
And they were strong enough to take tanks.
And very powerful exhaust systems, so that they could have all the equipment up and running.
Right. ready to drive
before
off.
they run off onto the beach and so on, or
I remember flying in an aeroflot plane. It was a passenger civil plane, but it was designed for the seats to fold down so pallets could be put on top of it. It was designed for paratroops to jump out of the back.
And of course, we on our side had the craft program, and
But these were civilian passenger
yes,
planes.
I understand. Well, you take civilian passenger planes, and we had stronger than normal floors built in, so that
Well, you couldn't jump out of our passenger
could be
well, you could, but
used as cargo planes, but they had everything like. Well, there was a very wonderful man named Navy Captain Jim Kehoe who tried to understand their naval construction and other shipbuilding. And at one point, the Soviets sold some of their cargo ships to somebody, and he went and looked at them. Well, they had citadels. They had some level of EMP protection.
which is very expensive to shield.
Yes,
wiring.
right. And things like that. So there were, many, many other areas where they invested. Also, there were whole program areas like civil defense shelters and the special provisions for protection of the leadership and
Now, is
so on.
one of the failures or difficulties of trying to include that in the assessments or the intelligence is it because we didn't have similar programs, we didn't really understand that, or was it more?
Well, we didn't. I think did not have the same level of. We had some, as we had this craft program and so on, but much, much less. And just much more widespread, systematic. No, it wasn't until much later that understood this, but I mean, remember sometime in the 80s when there were more emigres, one of them coming to see me. He had been a naval architect working in one of the shipbuilding organizations, I think up in the Leningrad area. And they had been approached at this particular shipyard by the Soviet fishing fleet to build tankers to service these ships that were spread around the world and would stay out for long periods of time. And so they came up with a ship design and a notion of the number they would need. And then, so the shipbuilding, the fishing people put it into the process, and out the other end, based on the intervention of people in the naval forces, a program with 3 different ship designs, twice the capacity, because this was a way of the Navy getting tankers, oilers, and so on.
Investing in capability.
Yes, but
we weren't counting that.
That's right. Unless it's the fact not even the emigre had come out, wouldn't even necessarily know, except that people had certainly noticed that the Navy had no oilers and tankers of its own.
So by the time you sort of felt like you had good data,
Yeah.
what was the percentage that they were spending? We thought that you believe that the Russians were spending of their economy?
I think it was between 25 and 35%.
And you also conclude, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but you also thought that their economy was a lot weaker.
Yes, well, that was the other
Side
big
of the
thing
equation.
that began to be raised. But that began in the very late 70s. Again, because of emigres who came out. And that raised questions about the estimates of the economy.
So was the end of the Cold War, assuming somebody did push the button, but was the end of the Cold War kind of inevitable? That is, they had such a poorly functioning economy and they were so overlading it with military thing that their economy was sort of bound to collapse no matter what we did?
Well, I think they were going to run out of steam. I mean, it was an unsustainable situation. I think that nonetheless the collapse was a surprise. I mean, that it all came apart so rapidly. I mean, we certainly were not predicting that. I mean, we were arguing all, from the earlier mid 70s through to the end that the burden was much higher than the CIA was.
And if people had taken that seriously earlier, they would have had at least been more open to the idea that economy was in much deeper trouble.
Yes, and to the kind of aspirations that Reagan had.
Right.
And but it also, in addition to this, it got us into looking at beyond just the military and the cost of it, the other kinds of problems the society had. I mean, they had pollution of various sorts.
Self-pollution, because people were
which
drinking
led
a lot.
to a tripling of birth defects. Also, the military people who were supervising the conscription process began complaining about the vigor and health of the people as they came up for conscription, and more people had to be excused for health reasons or just not up to it.
Right.
So that.
And alcoholism was a
Then the alcoholism.
I remember when the MiG-25 pilot defected, and he said the hard part, they couldn't to keep de-icing fluid in the planes because the troops were drinking it.
Yeah, right. Right.
Now you mentioned the Reagan administration. In our previous interview we talked about Schlesinger and Rumsfeld and Brown, and in some ways you would have thought that the Reagan administration was sort of the perfect moment for net assessment. That is, there's a president who really wants to have a competitive strategy. He's willing to put resources behind it. But it was a struggle time. They had a terrible, probably the worst transition period of any administration. They have a whole defense transition team that puts a whole transition together, and then it's just dismissed. None of it's basically accepted. And there was it was a struggling time. How did net assessment fit in with Secretary Weinberger when he came in and under Reagan?
Well, our connection directly with Weinberger was not very active. But Brown had, put net assessment under policy, and Clay.
Who was Fred Clay, who was now under Reagan, the new Undersecretary for Policy.
And was a good friend of mine who had been at Rand and so on. So we were very active, but not directly with the secretary. So Clay had us doing all kinds of things.
Now, was that...
But not so much on assessment matters in a way. We continued those all through the period, but special study efforts of one sort or another. I remember we ran a number of war games looking at the impact of supposing you could put up in space a ballistic missile defense system.
Some type of Star Wars thing.
What would its effect be? How would it change things? How effective does it have to be before it begins to have a major effect? And so we did, as I said, ran 14 war games looking at that. And so we had...
But that was kind of a switch for you. I remember in the 70s, you were not a big fan of war games.
No, I've always been a big fan of war games, but we didn't do very many. We tried to profit from whatever war games other people were doing.
Well, also in the 70s, it had been very popular to sort of have massive, complex computer games, but it was very hard to figure out.
Well, I never had much faith in them.
You preferred more of a classic Kriegspiel or a simulation, really, as opposed to a computerized war game.
Right.
Now,
and in fact, toward the end of Brown's period, there was it may have been a DSB,
Defense Science Board
meeting, and it had 3 parts, and I ran one part of it that was focused on the issue of possible problems and some fixes in the analysis of the kind of strategic nuclear balance. And one of the recommendations was that we use a gaming type of analysis, because that seemed to be the best way to integrate in some way or put in perspective the strategic balance with the theater balances, naval situation.
Because even though the services or analysts tended to treat them separately, in reality, if there was a war, they'd all be interconnected.
Right.
But let me go back to Weinberg for a second. What was that? Just he didn't appreciate or understand that assessment, or was it people who were getting in the way because you didn't have a direct access? What?
I don't really know. We were approached fairly early by Carlucci, who was the deputy, or I was. Personally, they were being kind of beaten up in the press and some in the Congress having no strategy, but just spending a lot of money. And
I remember when Weinberger recruited me to set up a strategy shop for him, and he goes, "I'm being accused of not having a strategy." So
Yeah.
I think I have one, because in all honesty, I'm not sure I know what a strategy, what strategy is. And he had us, to his credit, he at least admitted he didn't understand. But he had this then spend 6 months basically kind of running a tutorial on what is strategy.
Well, separately, I mean, Carlucci approached me, and I wrote him 2 memos. One on, I guess, what might a strategy look like, and so on, and then a second memo on, okay, if you want to develop some kind of organizational process, here's what that might look like.
Right.
They were done in beginning in the middle or fall of pretty early. I mean, maybe late. The first meeting I had in the late spring of '81.
Very early in the administration. And I always thought, just to move it away from an assessment and talk about subject matter, one thing I admired about the Carlucci-Weinberger relationship is they had total trust between each other. So Weinberger was sort of facing out, and Carlucci, who had a lot of experience, he'd been deputy at CIA, had been ambassador, and he was really running the inside of the building. And that seemed to be a pretty good combination, at least for those personalities.
Right. But mainly during the Eisenhower, the Reagan period, most of what we did was really directed by E. Clay. And then in particular, that became true beginning in summer of '86, when I was asked, along with Charlie Wolf of RAND, to run an effort in connection with this E. Clay Wohlstetter commission.
Mm-hmm. The National Strategy Commission was?
It was called the Commission on Integrated Long-Term Strategy, SILT.
Only Albert.
Right. So, and we were given the task of spelling out the future security environment.
As well as spelling out SILT.
Of the 20-year, right.
And that was really the first time, at least since the 50s, that somebody had put together that kind of long-term effort. But it was sort of doomed in a way, because it was almost at the end of the Cold War. It wasn't at the end of the Cold War, but it was sort of used.
Well, and also, I mean, it was, to my mind, a little disappointing, actually, because it ended up to being a little bit too backward-looking and not focusing enough on the longer-term future.
Yeah, it seems to me that if the difference between competitive strategy and a war strategy is, in a competitive strategy, you're thinking about the rival before you go to war. The difference between grand strategy and competitive strategy is grand strategy, you're thinking about a world where you can't even necessarily identify who the rival's going to be.
Yeah.
So you get caught in, like the Cold War, where you have a strong rival, and it's awful hard then to think about the world where that rival is gone and who might else appear out there, isn't it?
Well, it's harder, and I mean, because obviously, if you have a major rival, you can really, focus on that. But you could think of, well, particularly if in the case of the U.S., where we ended up after the collapse of the Soviet Union in such a dominant position, you can focus on how do I maintain this dominance for a long time, and then focus on longer term kind of trends and things that you want to continually be positioning yourself to.
Let me go back just to the later half, the late '80s or the second half of the '80s. Because I'd been involved in the early part of the '80s, I was under the impression that because we had not done as well in being on our competitive strategy, or the way we were implementing it, in terms of being frugal in areas where we didn't need to. We'd spent money so broadly that as by the mid '80s, his budgets start to level off, and then even start perhaps down. Our own strategy was not sustainable for another decade. So did you have that feeling in that period?
Well, I had some of that feeling. In fact, I wrote several memos to Clay, saying, that we're not being truly strategic and thinking ahead of.
Because the mistake or the strategy is not just about arguing spend more money, it's prioritizing, because there's never enough money to spend on everything.
Right. And then I think, when you look at that back at the history, when the Soviet Union did collapse, there was a lack of real strategy after that.
Right.
So that the efforts, so-called base force and all of these, were mainly efforts to just keep as much as what we had instead of this. There's a new set of problems or technology is changing. Where should we go?
Now, at least in the early stages of the immediate post-war, there was worry. Well, the Russians might come back or something. But pretty soon it became obvious. It was really a point that you made over and over the years. It was kind of organizations just sort of perpetuating their institutional.
Yeah, right.
Now, it's about that period that you start getting enthused or seeing the possibility of a revolution in military affairs, at least with.
Well, even before that, it is one of the things we raised in the future security environment that we did in the mid-'60s, the mid-'80s.
Right. Now, the Russians had coined the term.
Well, that's right. They had been raising this or saying this was happening or about to happen beginning in the late '70s.
Now, you really picked up that flag, and it became that, and with competitive strategy, some other things, really an Andy Marshall issue. What was because you 40 years that I've known you, you've been fairly selective in the battles that you've picked and deals to promote. Generally, you've been sort of much more reflective and sort of stay out of the proponency side. What was it about? What did you see in the revolution in military or the precision strike revolution that was driving you? What made you want to pick up that flag?
Well, it was. Well, let me say first, I didn't have, proposed, what the next system military should look like. It was more trying to say to people in the military, particularly the officer corps, that the Russians have, in fact, stated they think this is happening. I think they're right. And therefore, you and the Officer Corps and all of these services ought to be focused on, your view, developing appropriate concepts of operation, fostering the programs that you think make the best use of, where technology appears to be going and so on.
You said that to him, but what was the response?
Yes, and on the whole, I'd say it hasn't happened.
Now,
and in fact, I feel that we wouldn't be as far along in some of the areas where we've actually, done a lot better than in the other militaries, is because we've had actual operations going on that pushed us in the direction of, getting serious about operating UAVs.
Right. I remember in the 70s, the Kent Crescent, DARPA had a whole UAV program, and they weren't a lot. It's not like there was a technological breakthrough that took 30 years to get there. It was just a lack of kind of institutional interest. Right?
Well, in fact, Tom Earhart wrote his PhD thesis on the cultural and other obstacles in each of the services to acceptance of these devices.
It's ironic, and now he's the proponent of air-sealed he's winning with that resistance.
Well,
right?
But he was very astute, and it's a very interesting.
So what? You've been around the block. You've been there. You've seen it the inside. What? What's wrong? Why isn't there that willingness to take on innovation? And is it just?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to explain. But again, it's one of the reasons I had a number of these histories done. Beginning in the late 80s of, all right, if we're in one of these periods, let's look back at the history of earlier periods when there was one of these so-called revolutions in military affairs took place.
What was the aircraft carrier, the invention of the tank?
Well, it was the inner warrior, where you have the aircraft carrier and naval aviation.
Amphibious warfare.
You have amphibious warfare. You also have, the tank, combined arm things. Or you can go back to the middle of the 1800s, and you have, rifled weapons, the telegraph, and the railroad, and
yet during the Civil War, with the invention of more rapid firing weapons, people are still lining up or at least for the first couple of years, Napoleonic style.
Yeah, right. But they didn't really adopt the Gatling gun, could have been much more effectively used than it was.
Did you know that Custer had a Gatling gun and he decided not to take it with him? I think it was the last moment he regretted that.
Right, so, but the point is, and that I tried to make, later, is it can only be done by the Officer Corps. You can't have the answer developed outside and kind of.
So net assessment can't come in.
Can't do it. So we could run a lot of war games and put out ideas and so on, but for it to happen for real.
But that comes back to my question. And this is an assessment project. What has to happen in the officer corps?
Yes, well, I mean, people looked at that. I mean, Steve Rosen has his interesting book and so on.
But what?
Well, what it seems to have, I mean, the cases that we know the most about, I mean, there's a sub part of the officer corps that maybe is attached to, I mean, the airplane probably had a special advantage because people wanted to fly, you know, and
there's a whole new dimension to life.
Yes, right.
Where not everybody had a desire to drive around in a tank.
No.
or a submarine.
Right, yes, you know, so, but even then it was a battle for them to make it.
Now, what strikes me is both in the interwar period and even in our own experience.
You know, well, or you got to have somebody, you know,
who's a proponent.
A proponent. I mean, that's happened in the, you know, the big changes in the British Navy at the turn of the previous century.
Yeah, with Corbett and.
Well, not just Corbett. I mean the First Lord of the Admiralty, being very innovative and also in that case the pressure of cost, that a sense that they couldn't continue to operate the way they had been, and it's just too costly, and it just proposed a solution.
So is there a problem then that we don't nurture the proponents in the services? Do we not leave them there long enough? And one of the things that
well, I wonder about that. I mean, I have complained that I think the services may be much more effective in eliminating the heretics or the you know, the Billy Mitchells or the you know, people who cause a lot of problems, or
the Guderians, the Rommels, the de Gaulles. All of them were proponents that had enormous internal problems. It's interesting that you didn't, for a society that was so hierarchically organized and so rigid in so many ways. In some ways, the Russians had a better innovation system in terms of getting people, whether it was Kalashnikov and his weapon.
Well, there's that. I mean, it's not so much that. I think the thing that I would admire more about the Russians is that they contrived to produce this series or stream of people who are of military theorists. Mm-hmm.
Who actually, from Tukhachevsky on, who give the framework for for the where you could actually fit the So what does the precision strike regime or the revolution need? Does it need a air-sea battle, or is there some sort of a framework that it actually needs to really catch hold and?
Well, I don't know. You know, for a while. The services began to run their own war games, the Army in particular. General Sullivan,
Gordon Sullivan,
asked to see me when we were, I had, well, the other thing is this assessment that Krepenevich did, I mean, was consciously done in a different way than any other assessment we'd ever done.
How so?
Well,
this is Andrew Krepenevich, who later be the founder of
the normal thing was just someone in my office would be doing an assessment of some particular balance, and while we would take in there is whatever inputs we could get and so on, but it was strictly a paper to be go to the secretary for whatever help it was to them. But here it was an effort to create a kind of vocabulary, to involve people from around the building in discussing, are the Russians right? What kind of changes would be required if this kind of longer range precision strike systems existed.
But that process is going on, correct me, but it was sometime in the early 90s, right? I think I remember attending one of the first meetings in the early, it was about 92.
Yeah, right, yes. Probably 89 or 90.
And then 10 years later, Rumsfeld is very SecDef is saying how frustrated he is that it can't happen. And now we are here another 10 years,
right.
and relative to other countries around the world, you can hardly say that we've really implemented the revolution.
Well, relative to other countries, we've done well, because the surprise has been to the extent that, we have, in my view, rather partially and not very fully, kind of moved ahead. But we've done a lot better than anybody else. And the surprise is we've had this free ride for 20 years. And that's because I think one explanation is, the Russians, who clearly would have tried, collapse. The West Europeans' budgets are low.
There's no perceived
threat. The Japanese have their inhibitions. So the places that were the best positioned
in terms of technology and resources,
didn't do it.
But there was at least one country.
Yes, the Chinese are kind of moving along, but
who've been sort of coming up with
right.
Now, it's interesting. The Chinese generals, Chinese writers, describe you as the father of the revolution. As really the father of their what they view as their the concept of the technological revolution in military affairs.
Right.
Is that an appellation you wear with pride?
No, amusement, but not.
But it's interesting.
A former British intelligence friend of mine, he hopes that what they mean, that they've translated everything I published, not everything I wrote.
Because the vast majority of what you've written was to secretaries of defense and is still classified.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I hope so too. Well, I'd really like to take up this issue in our next session on China, because it seems to me that while we have, I don't disagree that we've pushed the state of the art, particularly in the target acquisition and information processing side. On the strike side, we're relatively limited. And if you sort of flip it around, the Chinese they're the ones that are developing a carrier killer. They're the ones that are proliferating systems.
Well, right.
So can we discuss that next time? I think it'd be a fun discussion.
All right.
You don't often get to sit down and argue with the inventor of a revolution in military affairs. Thank you very much, Andy. Okay. Thank you for joining us at Potomac's session on the Mind of the Strategist. I think you've seen it in its best form.